In the autumn of 1975, a young woman stepped out of her front door in a small town outside of Dayton, Ohio, told her husband she would be back before dinner, and never returned. Her name was Emily Harper. She was 24 years old. She had been married for exactly 21 days. The last person to see her alive, or at least the last person to see her at all, was her husband David, standing in the kitchen doorway watching her walk toward the blue sedan parked in the gravel drive. He waved. She waved back. That was the end of everything they had built together, and neither of them knew it yet. What makes this case different from the thousands of missing person files that gather dust in county offices across the country is not the disappearance itself. It is what came after. 35 years of silence. 35 years of a man placing fresh flowers beside a creek every October. And then, one quiet evening, a comment typed beneath a photograph of a restored car on a social media website changed everything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a life simply stops, you first have to understand the life that was living. David and Emily Harper were not the kind of couple people wrote stories about. They were ordinary in the way that most real love is ordinary. They had known each other since high school, though they did not start dating until 2 years after graduation, when they ran into each other at a hardware store where David worked part-time while finishing a certification in diesel mechanics. Emily was buying light bulbs for her mother's porch. David remembered later that she held the package up and asked him whether 40 watts or 60 watts would be better for keeping moths away. He told her 60. She told him he was wrong. They laughed. He asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. Their courtship was unhurried. 3 years of Friday night dinners, Sunday drives through the countryside south of town, long phone calls that made Emily's mother sigh and shake her head. David was quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. Emily was warmer, louder, the kind who remembered every neighbor's birthday and left handwritten cards in their mailboxes. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office downtown. He worked under trucks and tractors at a garage on Route 40. They were not wealthy. They did not need to be. They married on a Saturday in late September at the Methodist church Emily had attended since childhood. 43 guests, a potluck reception in the church hall. David wore a borrowed suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders. Emily wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist by a neighbor who sewed. During their first dance, David stepped on her foot twice. She whispered something in his ear that made him turn red, and the guests closest to them heard her say, "You owe me new shoes, Harper." He laughed so hard he nearly dropped her. The honeymoon was 3 days at a small lake cabin 2 hours north. They took photographs with a cheap film camera Emily had bought at a drugstore. They walked along the creek behind the property. She pointed at things constantly: a heron, a strange rock formation, an old service road barely visible through the trees. David pretended to be annoyed. He was not annoyed. He kept the camera pointed at her the entire time. They came home to the small 2-bedroom house David had been renting since he was 20. Emily hung curtains. David built a shelf for her books. They settled into the rhythm of new marriage, which is really just the rhythm of two people learning where the other leaves their shoes, how they take their coffee, what silence means when it arrives at 9 in the evening after a long day. Emily called her mother every Sunday. David mowed the lawn on Saturdays. They argued once about whether to paint the bedroom green or blue. They chose blue. 3 weeks into that ordinary life, on a Tuesday in mid-October, Emily mentioned over breakfast that she wanted to visit her mother. Margaret Harper lived about 12 miles east, past the creek road, past the old mill, in a farmhouse she had occupied since Emily's father passed in '69. Emily wanted to drop off a casserole and check on the gutters, which she worried her mother could not manage alone anymore. "I'll be back by 5, Emily said, pulling on her coat. "Maybe 5:30 if Mom starts talking about the church fundraiser." David was already in his work clothes, the blue jacket he wore every day at the garage, the one with the frayed collar and the oil stain on the left pocket that never fully came out. Emily had started calling him Blue because of it, a private nickname she used only when they were alone. "Don't forget to eat lunch," she said, kissing his cheek. "And not just a sandwich from the vending machine." "I'll eat," he said. She grabbed her purse, her keys, and the casserole dish wrapped in foil from the counter. At the door, she turned back. "Hey, Blue. Yeah. I love you, obviously, but I'm saying it." He smiled. "Obviously, go, your mom's waiting." She walked to the blue sedan, a 1971 model David had rebuilt the engine on as a wedding gift to himself. She set the casserole on the passenger seat, slid behind the wheel, and backed out of the gravel drive. David watched from the kitchen window until the car disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he rinsed his coffee mug, grabbed his lunch pail, and drove to the garage. The day passed the way days pass when nothing is wrong. David worked on a transmission. He ate a sandwich at noon, remembering Emily's warning, and added an apple. He talked to his coworker Ray about the Bengals game on Sunday. At 4:15, he wiped his hands on a rag and thought about heading home early. He figured Emily would already be there, maybe halfway through making dinner, maybe on the phone with her mother still. He pulled into the drive at 5:10. The house was dark. The blue sedan was not there. He was not worried, not yet. She had said 5:30. Margaret talked a lot, especially about the church. He went inside, turned on the lights, started filling a pot with water for pasta. He checked the clock. 5:20, 5:30, 5:40. At 6 o'clock, he picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's number. It rang 9 times before his mother-in-law answered. "Hey, Margaret, is Em still there?" A pause. "David, honey, she never came by today. I've been here all afternoon. I was expecting her around 2. Something cold moved through his chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just a small, wrong feeling, like a step that lands on nothing when you expect solid ground. "Are you sure? Maybe she stopped somewhere." "She didn't call, David. You know she always calls if she's running late." He hung up. He dialed Emily's friend Karen. No answer. He dialed the dental office. Closed. He dialed the church. No one there. He stood in the kitchen holding the phone, the pasta water boiling over onto the stove, and he felt the room get very quiet around him. By 7, he had called every relative, every friend, every neighbor whose number he could find. No one had seen Emily. No one had spoken to her. The casserole dish was never delivered. The blue sedan was never spotted on any road between their house and Margaret's. At 8:15, David called the county sheriff's office. A deputy named Carl Hutchins took the report. He asked the standard questions. "When did you last see her? What was she wearing? What car does she drive? Has she ever done anything like this before?" David answered each one carefully, his hands flat on the kitchen table, his voice steady in the way that people force steadiness when they are holding themselves together by the jaw. "She wouldn't just leave," David said. "She wouldn't." Hutchins told him they would look into it, told him to call back if he heard anything, told him to try to get some rest. David did not rest. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. It did not ring. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, the kind of October rain that turns dirt roads to mud and makes the creeks rise. He listened to it hit the roof and thought about Emily driving in it, and then he thought about Emily not driving at all, and he could not decide which thought frightened him more. If you are hearing this story for the first time, and you want to follow every twist this investigation takes over the next 35 years, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. The sun rose on a gray, wet Wednesday. David had not slept. He drove the route to Margaret's house slowly, scanning both sides of the road, pulling over twice to check ditches. Nothing. He drove it again. Nothing. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Hutchins listened politely and said a patrol unit would check the area. David went to the garage. He could not sit at home. He needed his hands to be busy. Ray took one look at his face and said, "Go home, man. I'll cover your bay." David shook his head. He stayed. He worked on a brake line for 4 hours without speaking. That afternoon, the rain intensified. By evening, The creek roads were flooding. And it was during that second night, while David sat again at his kitchen table with cold coffee and a notepad where he had written every number he had already called, that a farmer named Gene Aldrich phoned the sheriff's office to report a vehicle half-submerged beside Harlan Creek, about 3 miles south of the Harper house. A blue sedan, driver's door open, no one inside. David received the call at 9:40. He drove to the creek in the rain, headlights cutting through the dark, wipers working overtime. When he arrived, 2 patrol cars were already there, their red lights painting the wet trees. He got out and walked toward the water. The sedan sat at an angle in the mud, front end dipping toward the swollen creek. The driver's door hung open. Rain poured into the interior. The casserole dish was gone from the passenger seat. "Is she in there?" David asked. His voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. Hutchins shook his head. "No one's inside, Mr. Harper, we checked." David stared at the car, at the open door, at the water rushing past it, brown and fast and cold. Emily's purse was not there. Her keys were not in the ignition. The seat was empty. The seatbelt was unbuckled. "Where is she?" he whispered. No one answered. The creek kept moving. The rain kept falling. And somewhere in the dark beyond the reach of the patrol car headlights, the answer to that question was already 36 hours old, already scattered across miles of flooded road and rural silence, already beginning the long process of becoming a mystery that would outlast everyone who first tried to solve it. But on that Wednesday night, standing in the mud with rain running down his face, David Harper did not know any of that. He knew only that the car was there and Emily was not. He knew only that the driver's door was open, as though she had stepped out for just a moment, as though she meant to come right back. She did not come back, not that night, not the next, not for 35 years. And the question that would follow David Harper for the rest of his life, the question that would keep him awake in the dark and pull him back to that creek every October with fresh flowers in his hands, was not simply where Emily went. It was whether she ever left that car alive. The search began the following morning, once the rain eased enough for teams to move through the creek bed without being swept off their feet. The Harlan Creek watershed covered roughly 9 miles of uneven terrain, most of it wooded, most of it inaccessible by vehicle. The sheriff's department requested assistance from the state police and put out a call for volunteers through the local fire department. By 10 o'clock, nearly 40 people were spread along both banks, wading through knee-deep water, calling Emily's name into the gray October air. David wanted to join them. Hutchins told him no, told him he needed to be available for questions, needed to stay near a phone. David argued. Hutchins held firm. So David sat in his kitchen and listened to the radio scanner he had bought years ago for weather reports, and he heard the search teams calling in coordinates, calling in negative results, calling in the slow, grinding language of people who were looking for a body they expected to find. They did not find one. Not that day, not the next, not the following week. Divers went into the deeper pools downstream. They pulled out branches, a shopping cart, a rusted bicycle frame from the 60s. They did not pull out Emily Harper. The creek had been violent that night, the water level rising nearly 4 feet above normal, but the current had also deposited debris in predictable eddies along the banks. If a person had been carried by that water, the recovery teams explained carefully, the body would most likely surface within 3 to 5 miles. They searched 7, then 10, then 12. By the end of the second week, the official working theory shifted. The sedan, they determined, had likely hydroplaned on the creek road during the storm, slid down the embankment, and come to rest where it was found. The driver's door being open suggested Emily had exited the vehicle, possibly disoriented, possibly injured. The floodwater then rose around the car and eventually pushed it further downstream before it caught on a root system and settled. If Emily had been in the water, the current would have carried her. If she had been on the bank, injured and confused in the dark and the rain, she could have wandered. but the absence of a body troubled everyone. Hutchins mentioned it in his reports. The state police liaison mentioned it in his. No one said it plainly to David, but he heard it in the careful way they chose their words. They were no longer searching for a drowning victim. They were searching for a woman who might still be alive, or who might have died in a way that left no trace the creek could give back. It was on the 18th day that the case shifted for the first time. A volunteer named Tom Reedy, a retired postal worker who had joined the search because his wife went to church with Margaret Harper, was walking the embankment about 200 yards upstream from where the sedan had settled. The water had receded by then, leaving thick mud across everything. Reedy was scanning the ground for personal items, a shoe, a purse, anything, when he stopped. Footprints, small ones. A woman's shoe, maybe a size 7, pressing into the mud on the uphill side of the car, not toward the water, away from it. He flagged down a deputy. The deputy called Hutchins. Within an hour, a small team was photographing the prints, measuring the stride, noting the direction. The footprints led up the embankment, through a stretch of bare ground, and then onto a gravel shoulder that connected to Route 12, the rural highway that ran parallel to the creek about a quarter-mile east. Emily had walked away from the car. She had been alive after the accident. She had climbed out, found her footing, and moved toward the road. The prints disappeared at the highway's edge. The gravel there was too hard to hold an impression, and the rain had washed the shoulder clean. But the implication was clear. She had reached the road. Someone could have picked her up. Someone could have driven past. Someone could have stopped. Hutchins began canvassing the highway. Route 12 was not a busy road, but it was not empty either. Farm trucks, logging vehicles, the occasional commuter heading into Dayton. He posted a bulletin asking for anyone who had driven that stretch on the evening of October 14th between 4 and 7 p.m. to contact the sheriff's office. 3 days later, a long-haul trucker named Dale Fisk called in. He had been driving a loaded flatbed southbound on Route 12 around 5:15 that afternoon, before the worst of the rain hit. He remembered seeing a young woman on the shoulder, waving both arms, her hair plastered to her face, her coat dark and soaked. She looked frightened. She looked, he said, like someone who had been crying. "Why didn't you stop?" Hutchins asked. Fisk was quiet for a moment. "There was a car behind me, closer than I liked, and I figured, somebody else would get her. It wasn't like she was in the middle of nowhere. Cars come through there every few minutes. I thought, the next guy'll pull over." "The next guy?" Hutchins pressed him. "Did he see anyone else stop? Did he check his mirrors?" Fisk thought about it. "There was a pickup. Brown, I think, older model. It was slowing down when I passed it. I don't know if it stopped. I was watching the road ahead by then." A brown pickup. No make, no plate, no description of the driver. Fisk could not remember whether it had a camper shell or a flat bed. Could not remember if it was Ford or Chevy. Could not remember much of anything except the girl waving and his own decision to keep driving, a decision that had bothered him for 18 days and would bother him, he told Hutchins, for the rest of his life. A second witness came forward the following week. A woman named Patricia Yoon, who lived in a farmhouse along Route 12, said she had been closing her barn around 5:30 and saw a brown pickup pulled over on the shoulder, maybe 200 yards from her property line. She could not see inside the cab. She could not see a plate. She assumed it was a neighbor checking a fence line. She went inside. She did not think about it again until she saw the bulletin in the post office 3 weeks later. No license plate. No driver description. No confirmation that Emily was actually in that truck. Just a brown pickup, slowing down, possibly stopping, on a rural highway in the rain, in the dark, in a year when no one carried a camera in their pocket and no one thought to write down a number they might need later. Hutchins ran every brown pickup registered in the county, then the surrounding counties, then the state, hundreds of vehicles, dead end after dead end, owners with alibis, vehicles that had been sold, scrapped, exported. The investigation ground forward like a wheel spinning in mud. And then, as happens in small towns when a mystery has no answer, the talking started. It began quietly, a comment at the grocery store, a whisper after church. Emily had seemed uncertain about the wedding. Emily had told someone she was not sure she was ready. Emily had been seen arguing with David at the hardware store 2 weeks before the ceremony. None of it was true, or rather, none of it was the whole truth. Emily had been nervous before the wedding, the way anyone is nervous. She had cried during the rehearsal dinner, which was normal. She had joked with Corinne about cold feet, which was also normal. But in the absence of facts, small truths became large suspicions. David felt the shift. He noticed it in the way people looked at him at the garage, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. Margaret stopped calling on Sundays. Not because she blamed him, she told him later, but because hearing his voice made her cry and she could not bear to cry every week. David understood. He did not blame her. He did not blame anyone. He simply went to work, came home, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for a phone call that did not come. Then the financial records arrived. Hutchins pulled Emily's bank statements as part of standard procedure. On the morning of October 14th, the same day she disappeared, Emily had withdrawn $45 in cash from the teller window at the First National branch downtown. She had done this before heading home to make the casserole. $45 was not a large sum, but in the context of a woman who vanished without her purse, without her keys, without telling anyone where she was going, it raised a question. Had she planned to leave? Had the cash been for a bus ticket, a motel room, a new start? The theory was not stated officially. It did not need to be. It lived in the pauses between Hutchins's questions, in the way he asked David whether Emily had seemed unhappy, whether she had mentioned wanting time alone, whether she had friends in other states. David heard what was underneath the questions. He set his hands flat on the table. "She was buying me a birthday present," he said. His birthday was October 19th, 5 days after she vanished. She'd been saving up for a watch. She told me last week she needed to get cash because the jewelry store on Main didn't take cards for layaway. Hutchins wrote it down, but the theory did not die that easily. It took Corinne, Emily's closest friend since the 7th grade, to put it to rest. Corinne came to the sheriff's office on her own, uninvited, and sat across from Hutchins with her hands folded in her lap. "She was buying David a watch," Corinne said. "A Timex, silver band. She'd been looking at it for 2 months. She made me promise not to tell him. She was going to wrap it in that stupid blue paper he liked and leave it on his pillow the night before." Corinne's voice cracked. She pressed her lips together. She was not running away. She was buying her husband a birthday present. And then she drove to her mother's house with a casserole, and she never got there. "And I need you to stop looking at David like he did something." Hutchins nodded. He closed the file on the voluntary disappearance theory, but the damage was done. The rumor had spread. In a town of 4,000 people, a whisper travels faster than a correction. David remained, in the minds of some, the husband who could not account for his wife's last hours, the husband who stood in his kitchen while she drove into the rain, the husband who, some people decided, knew more than he was saying. He knew nothing. That was the worst part. He knew exactly as much as everyone else, which was nothing at all. If this case has pulled you in, and you want to see where the investigation goes from here, take a moment to subscribe so the next chapter finds you. The weeks turned into months. Winter came. The creek froze. The search teams went home. The file on Emily Harper moved from active to open to the slow, quiet shelf where cases go when the leads run dry but no one is willing to write the word closed. Hutchins checked in with David once a month for the first year, then once a quarter. Then the calls stretched to twice a year, always around the anniversary, always the same gentle questions. Anything new, any memory, any small detail. David had no new details. He had the same ones played on a loop. The casserole, the wave from the doorway, the blue jacket, the nickname, the last sentence she spoke. "I love you, obviously, but I'm saying it." He kept the blue jacket. He wore it to work every day until the garage closed in '83. Then he hung it in the closet and did not touch it again. And the brown pickup, the one that may or may not have stopped on Route 12 in the rain, the one with no plate and no driver and no confirmation that Emily Harper ever climbed inside, remained the single thread connecting the known to the unknown. Hutchins chased it for 3 more years before the department reassigned him to Traffic Division. His replacement, a younger deputy named Alan Briggs, inherited the file, read it twice, and placed it in a drawer. The drawer stayed closed for a long time. But the case did not stay buried. Not entirely. Because in the spring of 1978, nearly 3 years after Emily Harper walked away from a blue sedan in the rain, a team of county engineers conducting a routine survey of the Harlan Creek watershed pulled something from the silt nearly 2 miles downstream from the original site. Twisted metal, a shattered headlight assembly, a section of door panel with the interior handle still attached. Pieces of the blue sedan, carried much farther than anyone had believed possible. The flood, it turned out, had been more violent than the initial assessment suggested. The current that night had not simply risen. It had surged, torn, and redistributed everything in its path across a far wider stretch of terrain than the search teams had covered. The discovery changed the official classification. Emily Harper's case was reclassified from missing, presumed dead, to unresolved. The distinction mattered to the department's paperwork. It mattered to the statute of limitations on certain investigative resources. It did not matter to David, who still set 2 plates at dinner out of habit, who still slept on the left side of the bed, who still drove past the creek on his way to work and did not look. But the pieces of the car raised a question that would sit unanswered in that file drawer for years. If the flood was powerful enough to tear the sedan apart and scatter it 2 miles downstream, then the working theory of a simple hydroplane and slide was wrong. The accident had been more severe. The impact harder. The injuries Emily sustained in those first seconds, before she opened the door and climbed into the rain, may have been worse than anyone imagined. And if she was hurt, confused, bleeding, stumbling along a dark highway in a storm, then the person who stopped that brown pickup was not simply offering a ride. They were the last person to see Emily Harper before she became someone else entirely. Who was driving that truck? Where did it go? And why, in 3 years of searching, had no one found it? The years moved the way years move when you are waiting for something that does not arrive. Slowly at first, then all at once, then slowly again. David Harper turned 30, then 35, then 40. The garage where he worked closed in '83 and he took a position at a different shop across town, smaller, quieter, doing the same work with his hands. He did not remarry. People asked, gently at first, then less gently, then not at all. He had a way of looking at them when the question came, not angry, just tired, as though the answer was so obvious it did not require words. He was married. His wife was missing. Those 2 facts occupied the same space in his life, and neither one canceled the other. Every October 14th he drove to Harlan Creek. He carried a small bouquet, usually carnations because Emily had liked them, wrapped in newspaper because he never remembered to buy tissue paper. He placed them on the bank where the sedan had been found, stood for a few minutes, and drove home. Some years it rained. Some years the creek was low and calm, barely ankle deep, and it seemed impossible that it had ever risen high enough to swallow a car. Some years the water was brown and fast and he stood farther back. He never spoke aloud. He did not need to. The silence was the conversation. Margaret Harper passed in the winter of '91. David drove to the funeral. He sat in the back pew. Margaret's sister thanked him for coming. He nodded. He drove home. He made dinner for one. The case file gathered dust in the county record's office. Deputy Briggs, who had inherited it, retired in '94. His replacement never opened the drawer. The brown pickup became a ghost, a shape without substance, a vehicle that may have existed only in the uncertain memory of a trucker who felt guilty and a farmer's wife who glanced out her barn door for 3 seconds. David turned 50, then 55. The town changed around him. The hardware store became a phone shop. The dental office where Emily worked became a tax preparation service. The Methodist church added a parking lot where the potluck hall used to be. David noticed these changes the way you notice weather passively without surprise. He lived in the same house. He kept the same routines. He fixed things for neighbors on weekends. He ate dinner at 6. He went to bed at 10. He did not sleep well. He had not slept well in 20 years. It was in the autumn of 2003, 28 years after Emily disappeared, that David decided to clean the attic. He had been putting it off for years. The attic held boxes from the move-in, old tax documents, broken appliances he meant to fix, and a wooden crate of photographs from both their families. He had gone up there looking for a specific wrench, a 3/4-inch socket he remembered tossing into a toolbox sometime in the 80s. He found the wrench. He also found, wedged behind a stack of National Geographics, a small cardboard box with a drugstore logo faded nearly to nothing. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film, 24 exposures. The label on the canister read in Emily's handwriting, Lake Trip, Sept 75. Their honeymoon. David sat on the attic floor for a long time holding the canister. He turned it over in his fingers. The metal was cool. The cardboard was soft with age. He could not remember why it had never been developed. Maybe they had forgotten. Maybe Emily had meant to drop it off and the weeks slipped by. Maybe it had fallen behind a box during the move from the bedroom to the attic and simply stayed there, waiting in the dark for 28 years. He took it to the 1-hour photo shop on Route 40, the same strip mall where the old hardware store used to be. The teenager behind the counter looked at the canister like it was an artifact from another civilization. "We don't really do film anymore," he said, but there was a lab in Dayton that still processed it. 2 weeks later, David received a manila envelope with 22 prints. 2 exposures had been ruined by light leaks. The rest were clear. Emily at the lake, squinting into the sun. Emily holding a stick she had found, posing like a sword fighter. Emily sitting on the cabin porch with her shoes off, her feet dirty, grinning at the camera. David in the background of several frames, always slightly blurred, always looking at her instead of the lens. And then, near the end of the roll, a photograph that made David set the envelope down on the kitchen table and press both palms flat against the wood. Emily stood beside the creek behind the cabin, the same creek, not Harlan Creek, but the same waterway, the same watershed, the same stretch of land a few miles upstream from where her car would be found 3 weeks later. She was smiling, pointing at something behind the camera, but it was not her smile that stopped David's breath. It was what she was pointing at. Behind her, barely visible through the October brush, a narrow dirt road cut into the tree line. An old service road, overgrown, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. Emily had pointed at it in the photograph, her finger extended, her mouth open as though she were saying something. "Look at that. What is that? Let's go see." David stared at the road in the photograph. He had been to that creek. He had walked that bank during the honeymoon. He did not remember a service road. He did not remember Emily pointing at one. But there it was, captured in silver halide and light, preserved for 28 years in a cardboard box in his attic. The road had never appeared in any police report, not in Hutchins's initial survey, not in the search team maps, not in the engineer's watershed assessment. No one had walked that stretch of creek looking for a road because no one knew it existed. David brought the photograph to the sheriff's office the next morning. The current sheriff, a woman named Linda Torres who had taken the position in '98, listened to him explain. She studied the photograph. She pulled the old case file from storage, the first time it had been opened in nearly a decade. "We'll take a look," she said. It took 3 weeks to organize. A small team, 2 deputies and a county surveyor, walked the creek bank upstream from the original site. They found it on the second day. The service road was still there, narrower than it appeared in the photograph, choked with 28 years of growth, but the gravel base was intact beneath the soil. It led east, away from the creek, through a stretch of dense woodland for approximately 1.5 miles. It ended at a clearing, and in the clearing stood the remains of a farmhouse. The structure was in poor shape. The roof had partially collapsed. The windows were gone, but the foundation was solid and the layout was still readable. 3 rooms, a root cellar, a detached garage with a concrete floor stained dark with old oil. County records identified the property. In 1975, the farmhouse had been occupied by a man named Walter Briggs, retired mechanic, 63 years old at the time, widower. He had lived there alone after his wife passed in 71. He died in 1988 of a heart attack in the county hospital with no next of kin present. Walter Briggs, a retired mechanic, living alone on an isolated service road that connected to the creek where Emily's car was found. A man who spent his life fixing engines and transmissions and brake lines. A man who would have known, instinctively, what to do when he heard a crash in the storm. Sheriff Torres tracked down Walter's surviving family. A daughter, Ruth Briggs Callahan, 61, living in a suburb outside Columbus. Torres called her on a Thursday afternoon. Ruth answered on the 3rd ring. "Your father," Torres began after identifying herself. "Walter Briggs, the property on Harlan Creek. I need to ask you about the fall of 1975. A long pause, then Ruth's voice careful, measured. "What about it? Did your father ever mention rescuing someone during the storm that October? A young woman, possibly injured?" Another pause, longer this time. David, sitting in Torres' office listening on the speakerphone, heard Ruth breathe in slowly. "He mentioned it once," Ruth said. "Years later, we were having dinner, maybe 82, 83. He said he'd found a girl during the flood, hurt, confused. He brought her inside, cleaned her up. He said he figured the sheriff would handle it, that someone must have already called it in. He didn't want to get involved." Ruth stopped. "I asked him what happened to her. He said she left the next morning. Said some people from the county came and got her. Social workers, he thought. He didn't ask for names." Torres wrote it down. "Did he file a report?" "He said he called the sheriff's office that night, or the next morning. He wasn't sure. He was old by then, Sheriff. His memory wasn't what it used to be." Ruth's voice tightened. "But I remember him saying it. I remember because it bothered him. He kept saying I should have driven her myself. I should have made sure." He said it more than once. No official rescue report existed in the sheriff's records. No call log from October 14th or 15th mentioned a Walter Briggs. If he had called, the record was gone, lost in the transition from paper logs to digital systems, or simply never written down by whoever answered the phone that night. Torres requested access to the Briggs property. Ruth agreed, though she noted that most of her father's belongings had been cleared out after his death. The house had sat empty for 15 years, but the garage, she said, might still have his workbench, his notebooks. He had kept notebooks his entire life, small spiral-bound things where he logged repairs, parts orders, weather observations. He wrote everything down, Ruth said, except the things that mattered, apparently. The team searched the garage on a cold November morning. The workbench was still there, bolted to the wall, covered in a skin of dust and mouse droppings. Tools hung on pegboard, rusted but recognizable. And on a shelf above the bench, beneath a collapsed section of roofing, they found a stack of notebooks. 7 in total, water-damaged, some pages stuck together, some illegible. The 5th notebook covered the autumn of 1975. Most entries were mundane. Oil change on the Ford. Replaced the well pump. Rain 3 days running. Then, on the page dated October 14th, in Walter Briggs's cramped, slanted handwriting, a single entry. Young woman, head injury, couldn't remember her name. Brought her in from the road. Storm too bad to drive, gave her the cot. She kept saying one word, don't know what it means. We'll call sheriff in the morning. David read the entry standing in the garage, the notebook held open in his gloved hands. His throat tightened. He looked at Torres. Torres looked at the notebook. "One word," David said quietly. "What word?" The entry did not say. Walter had written one word and moved on. The next page, which should have covered October 15th, the morning Emily supposedly left with social workers, was torn out. The following 3 pages were missing as well. The notebook resumed on October 19th with a note about ordering a new carburetor. If you have been following this case from the beginning, and you want to be here when the final pieces fall into place, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Torres bagged the notebook as evidence. She assigned 2 investigators to the Briggs connection full-time. They pulled Walter's phone records from the phone company, but records from 1975 had been purged decades ago. They checked county social services for any intake matching Emily's description in October of '75. Nothing. They checked every agency, every church group, every volunteer organization that might have responded to a rural emergency during the flood. No record of a young woman being picked up from the Briggs property. No record of Walter Briggs calling anyone. Ruth, when pressed, could offer nothing more. Her father had been a private man, stubborn, the kind who fixed his own roof, grew his own vegetables, and did not ask for help. If he believed the authorities were handling the situation, he would not have followed up. He would have assumed it was done. He would have gone back to his workbench and his notebooks and his quiet life on the service road. And the young woman with the head injury would have become a single paragraph in a spiral-bound journal, and then nothing. But the entry changed everything. It confirmed what the footprints had suggested. Emily survived the crash. She reached the road. Someone found her. Walter Briggs found her. He took her inside. He treated her head injury. She was alive, conscious, speaking on the night of October 14th, 1975. And then she was gone. Not dead, not drowned, not swept away by the creek. Gone, taken somewhere by people Walter assumed were social workers but who left no paper trail in any agency in the state of Ohio. The final pages of the notebook were missing. The phone records were destroyed. The social services files were empty. Walter was dead. The farmhouse was rotting. And the one word Emily kept saying, the word Walter could not identify, the word that might have told him who she was, where she came from, who was waiting for her at home with a blue jacket and a kitchen full of cold pasta water, was not written down. It was lost. Or so everyone believed. Because 600 miles south, in a small regional clinic that had closed in 1981, a retired nurse named Dorothy Fenn was watching the evening news in her living room when a reporter mentioned the reopening of the Emily Harper case. Dorothy set down her tea. She stared at the television, and a memory, buried for 28 years beneath 1,000 ordinary days, surfaced like something rising from deep water. She picked up the phone. She dialed the number on the screen, and when the sheriff's office answered, she said, "I think I treated that girl. I think I know the word she kept saying." Dorothy Fenn was 74 years old, widowed, living in a small brick house outside of Lexington, Kentucky, roughly 600 miles south of Harlan Creek. She had worked as a registered nurse for 31 years, most of them at a small regional clinic called Milldale Medical, which had served the rural communities along the Kentucky-Ohio border before closing its doors in 1981 due to funding cuts. She had not thought about that clinic in years. She had not thought about the flood, or the young woman, or the word. But the reporter on the television had said the name Emily Harper, and something in Dorothy's chest had pulled tight, the way a muscle remembers an old injury when the weather changes. She spoke to Sheriff Torres by phone the following morning. Her voice was steady, precise, the voice of a woman accustomed to relaying symptoms and dosages and patient histories. She remembered the night clearly, or as clearly as 28 years allowed. "It was the 15th, Dorothy said. Or maybe the 16th. The roads were still a mess. A man brought her in. Older fellow, worked clothes, hands like a mechanic. He said he found her on the road during the storm. Head wound, bad one, along the left side. She was conscious but confused, couldn't tell him her name, couldn't tell him where she was from. He'd kept her overnight, tried to get her to talk, but she just kept repeating one word. What word? Torres asked. Blue, over and over, blue, blue, like she was trying to call someone or remember something. The man, he figured she meant the car, said there was a blue sedan in the creek. He thought maybe she was trying to say she'd been in a blue car. Dorothy paused. He left her with us, said he had to get back, had animals to tend. I wrote up the intake. Unidentified female, approximate age 20 to 25, laceration to the left temporal region, possible concussion, severe disorientation. We cleaned the wound, stitched it, kept her overnight for observation. Did you report her to local authorities? We tried. The phone lines were down in 2 counties. The roads were impassable. By the time we could get through, it had been 2 days, and by then the flood had overwhelmed every emergency service in the region. Missing persons, stranded families, property damage. We were told to hold non-critical cases and report when the lines cleared. Dorothy's voice flattened. The lines cleared. I filed the report, or I thought I filed it. The clinic was in chaos that week. 3 of our staff couldn't get in. We were running on generators. Torres asked about records. Dorothy's answer was the one Torres had been dreading. Milldale closed in '81. The building was sold. Most of the patient files were transferred to the county health department. But in '86, there was a fire at the county storage facility, electrical fault. They lost nearly everything from the '70s and early '80s. Dorothy paused. I remember because I got a letter saying my employment records were gone. I thought, well, that's that. No one's going to need those old files. No files, no intake record, no name, no next of kin. Just Dorothy Fenn's memory, 28 years old, and the image of a young woman on a clinic cot, stitched above the left ear, staring at the ceiling, whispering a single word. Blue. Torres relayed the information to David the same afternoon. He was sitting in her office, as he had been sitting in sheriff's offices and deputy kitchens and investigation rooms for nearly 3 decades. He listened. He nodded, and then he went very still. Blue, he repeated. Yes, the nurse said the woman kept saying it. Everyone assumed it referred to the car. David's hands were in his lap, his fingers tightened. It wasn't the car. Torres waited. She called me Blue. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. Because of the jacket, the blue work jacket. She started calling me that the first week we were married. Only her. No one else. If she was hurt, confused, trying to say a name, trying to call for someone, she wouldn't say David. She'd say Blue. The room was silent for a moment. Torres watched David's face. She had seen grief in many forms over her career. This was not the sharp, fresh grief of a new loss. This was the old kind, the kind that had been carried so long it had become structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of a person's life. And now someone had touched a beam and the whole structure was shifting. She was alive, David said. She was in a clinic, she was saying my name, and no one knew who she was. No one connected her, Torres said gently. The flood disrupted communications across 3 counties. The clinic was overwhelmed. The records were lost. It wasn't malice, Mr. Harper. It was chaos. David nodded. He did not argue. He did not rage. He simply sat with the knowledge that Emily had been alive, injured, calling for him in the only language she had left, and the world had heard a color instead of a name. The investigation moved quickly after that. Torres' team traced the chain from Milldale Medical forward. Dorothy Fenn, despite the lost records, remembered one more detail. The young woman had been transferred after 3 days, not to a hospital, not to a police station, to a recovery home. It was run by a church group, Dorothy said. Grace Fellowship out of Ashland. They took in adults who had temporary memory issues, head injuries, disorientation. People who couldn't be released but didn't need a hospital. The clinic had an arrangement with them. We'd call, they'd send a van. Grace Fellowship Recovery Home. Torres investigators found that the organization had operated from 1969 through 1993, when it closed due to the retirement of its founding pastor. The building, a converted farmhouse outside Ashland, Kentucky, had been sold and demolished in '97. Most administrative records were kept in the pastor's home office. When he died in 2001, his family donated boxes of documents to a local historical society. The historical society, understaffed and underfunded, had stored the boxes in a basement. Many had water damage, many were incomplete, but some survived. A partial intake log from the autumn of 1975 listed an entry dated October 18th. Unidentified female, approx. 24, referred by Milldale Medical, head injury, memory impairment, no identification, no known family. The name field was blank. In the margin, in a different hand, someone had written a single word in pencil. Emma. Not her name, a name given to her, a placeholder. The volunteers at Grace Fellowship, unable to identify her, unable to find a family, unable to get her to say anything other than that one repeated word, had simply chosen a name. Emma, close enough to the sound she made when she was trying to speak, close enough to be kind. Tours tracked down former volunteers. 3 responded. A woman named Helen Marsh, who had worked at the home from 73 through 79, remembered Emma clearly. She was quiet, Helen said, sitting at her kitchen table in Ashland, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Physically, she healed fast. The head wound closed, the bruises faded, but her memory, that was different. She knew words. She knew how to eat, how to dress, how to walk, but she didn't know who she was. She didn't know where she came from. She'd sit by the window for hours just looking out. Sometimes she'd say that word, blue, over and over, soft like a prayer. Did she ever recover any memories? Tours asked. Fragments. After a few months, she started remembering small things. A kitchen, a gravel road, the smell of engine oil. She'd say them out loud like she was testing them. Kitchen, gravel, oil, but she couldn't put them together, couldn't build a story, couldn't say a name or a town or a date. Helen paused. We tried, God knows we tried. We posted descriptions with the county. We called hospitals, shelters, police departments in 3 states. No one came looking. No one matched her to a missing person report. Why not? Tours asked. Emily Harper was reported missing in Ohio. Her description was in the system. Helen shook her head. You have to understand how it worked back then. No national database. No computers. Missing person reports were paper files in individual county offices. If the sheriff in Dayton, Ohio, filed a report and a church home in Ashland, Kentucky, called the sheriff in their own county, those 2 pieces of paper never met. Not unless someone physically drove one to the other. And in the middle of a flood with roads out and phones down, nobody was driving anywhere. The system had not failed Emily Harper through malice or negligence. It had failed her through distance, through paper, through the simple, ordinary limitations of a world that had not yet learned to connect its records electronically. A missing woman in one county was invisible to a recovery home in another. A name whispered by a confused patient meant nothing to a volunteer who had no file to check it against. Emma stayed at Grace Fellowship for approximately 4 months. Helen remembered the departure because it was unusual. Most residents either recovered enough to be placed with family or were transferred to longer-term care. Emma simply left. One morning in February, her cot was empty. Her clothes were gone. The back door was unlocked. She'd walked out. Helen's voice carried a note of old guilt. We searched. We called the sheriff, but there was nothing to report. She was an adult. She hadn't committed a crime. She was free to leave. And without a name, without an identity, there was no one to notify, no family to call, no address to check. Did she say where she was going? No, she never said much, but the night before she left, I remember she was sitting by the window and she turned to me and said, I think I had a husband, just that. I think I had a husband. And then she went back to looking out the window. Helen's eyes were wet. I should have done more. I should have held her. I should have called someone, but I didn't know who to call. Emma walked out of Grace Fellowship Recovery Home on a cold February morning in 1976, 4 months after she had climbed out of a blue sedan in the rain. She had no name, no address, no memory of a wedding, a honeymoon, a casserole, a blue jacket, or a man standing in a kitchen doorway waving goodbye. She had a healed scar behind her left ear, a faint smell of engine oil she could not explain, and a word she whispered when she thought no one was listening. Blue. And then she was gone. No forwarding address, no trail, no record. The file at Grace Fellowship was closed. The volunteers moved on to other residents. Helen Marsh retired in '79 and tried not to think about the quiet girl by the window. The trail that had stretched from Harlan Creek to a rural highway to a mechanic's farmhouse to a regional clinic to a church recovery home simply ended. Not with a door slamming shut, not with a lock turning, just with an empty cot on a February morning and an unlocked back door, and a woman walking into a world that did not know her name. Torres sat in her office after the last interview, the file spread across her desk. 28 years of silence, and now, in the span of a few weeks, the silence had cracked open and poured out a story so layered, so full of small failures and ordinary mistakes, that it felt less like a mystery and more like a slow, grinding accident. No villain, no conspiracy. Just a storm, a head injury, a phone line down, a paper file in the wrong office, a word mistaken for a color, a name never written down, and a woman walking out a back door into a life she never chose. David sat across from her. He had listened to all of it, every interview, every dead end, every small, heartbreaking detail. He knew now that Emily had survived. He knew she had been hurt, confused, alone. He knew she had tried to say his name and the world had heard something else. He knew she had walked away from a recovery home with no memory of him, no memory of their wedding, no memory of the life they had built in 3 short weeks. But he did not know where she went. Not yet. The file was reclassified again, not unresolved this time. Active. Torres assigned a dedicated investigator. The description of Emma, the approximate age, the scar behind the left ear, the word she repeated, went out to every agency that might hold a record. Social Security applications, hospital admissions, marriage licenses, driver's license registrations, anything filed under the name Emma or any variation between 1976 and the present. The search was vast, the needle was small, and the years between '76 and now were a long, long time for a woman with no past to build a future no one could trace. David went home, he made dinner. He ate at the table where he had eaten 10,000 meals alone. He washed his plate, he dried it, he put it away. And then he sat in the living room in the dark and whispered a word into the empty house. Blue. No one answered. No one had answered in 28 years. But the search was not over. It was only changing shape. Because the world that had failed Emily Harper in 1975, the world of paper files and downed phone lines and county borders that might as well have been oceans, was no longer the world David Harper lived in. The world had grown smaller, faster, connected by wires and signals and glowing screens. And in that new world, a woman with no past might, without knowing it, leave a trace. A comment, a photograph, a single sentence typed beneath an image of a car she almost died in. But that was still 7 years away, and David did not know it yet. He did not know that the answer was not in a file cabinet or a sheriff's drawer or a church basement. It was on a screen, in a group of strangers who loved old cars, waiting for him to scroll far enough, click far enough, look closely enough at a photograph of a woman he had not seen in 28 years. He did not know that the mystery was almost over. He only knew that the woman he loved had been alive, had been fighting, had been trying to come home, and the world had let her walk away. And that knowledge, painful as it was, changed something in him. It did not heal the wound, but it shifted the weight. For the first time in 28 years, David Harper was not waiting for a body to surface from a creek. He was waiting for a woman to remember his name. 7 years passed. The investigation, now officially active under Sheriff Torres' office, moved in slow circles. Names were checked, records were requested. The description of Emma, the scar, the approximate age, went into systems that were better than the ones that had failed in 1975 but still not perfect. Emma Lawson, if that was the name she had chosen, had left no obvious trail. No social security application matched. No hospital admission in 3 states aligned. The woman had walked out of a recovery home in February of '76, and as far as any government record showed, simply ceased to exist. David turned 63, then 64. He retired from the garage in 2008, his knees finally giving out after 40 years of concrete floors and crouching under vehicles. He filled the days with small projects, fixing a neighbor's fence, rebuilding a birdhouse, reading, watching television he did not particularly enjoy. His niece, Corinne's daughter, visited on Sundays and brought groceries. He was not lonely exactly. Loneliness implied a lack. What David had was a presence, a constant, low hum of absence that had been there so long it felt like furniture. In the spring of 2010, his niece set him up with a computer. "You need to get online, Uncle David," she said, plugging in the monitor on his kitchen table. "Email, news, you can look up old friends." He resisted. She persisted. He relented. He was not searching for Emily. He had stopped searching in the active sense years ago. The investigation belonged to Tors and her team now. His role was to answer questions, provide photographs, submit to the occasional interview. He was a witness in his own life, a man who had lost someone and was asked, periodically, to describe the shape of the loss. What he did online was small. He joined a group for former students of his high school class. He reconnected with Ray, his old coworker from the garage who had moved to Florida. He browsed. He read. He did not post much. And then, on an evening in late September, 5 days before the 35th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, he clicked on a link a classmate had shared. A classic car restoration group. Hundreds of members posting photographs of vehicles they had rebuilt, repainted, rescued from barns and junkyards. David scrolled without much interest. A red Mustang, a green Chevy truck, a white Cadillac with chrome bumpers. And then a blue sedan. A 1971 model, restored to showroom condition, the paint gleaming, the interior immaculate. Someone had posted 3 photographs and a paragraph about replacing the carburetor and reupholstering the seats. David stopped scrolling. His hand rested on the mouse. He stared at the car. It was not Emily's car. The shape was slightly different, the trim a year off. But the color was the same, that particular blue. The blue he had mixed himself in the garage, the blue she had laughed at because it was too bright, the blue he had repainted twice before she said, "That's the one blue, that's the color." He was about to scroll past when he saw the comments beneath the photograph. 4 of them, compliments, questions about the engine, and then the 5th. A woman named Emma Lawson, profile picture small, slightly blurred, and beneath it a single sentence. "That looks just like the car I almost died in back in '75. David did not breathe. He read the sentence again and again. The words did not change. 75. A blue sedan almost died. He clicked on the profile. Emma Lawson. Location listed as a small town in eastern Oregon, nearly 2,000 miles from Harlan Creek. Few public photographs, a garden, a cat, a porch with a rocking chair, and one image taken at what appeared to be a community picnic, showing a woman in her late 50s, gray-haired, smiling, turning slightly to the left. Behind her left ear, barely visible in the low-resolution photograph, a small crescent-shaped scar. Emily had gotten that scar at 14, falling off a bicycle into a gravel driveway. A curved cut, healed into a pale crescent that her hair usually covered. David had kissed it 100 times. He knew its shape the way he knew the lines of his own palms. He did not message her. He did not call. He picked up the phone and dialed Sheriff Tors' office. Tors listened. She pulled the file. She assigned 2 investigators to verify the profile, cross-reference the location, and make contact through official channels. They compared the picnic photograph to Emily's wedding portraits, her high school yearbook picture, the honeymoon snapshots David had developed 7 years earlier. The resemblance was strong. The bone structure, the jaw, the set of the eyes. But 35 years changed a face. Weight, weather, time. The investigators could not confirm identity from a photograph alone. They needed Emma Lawson to agree to speak with them, and to their relief, she did. The local sheriff's office in Oregon made the initial contact. Emma Lawson, 62, widowed, living alone in a small house with a garden and a cat, listened to the explanation with what the deputy described as polite confusion. She did not remember the 70s. She did not remember before. Her life, as far as she could reconstruct it, began in the late 70s in a town in Kentucky where she had taken a job at a laundromat under the name Emma, because it was the only name she had. She had married a kind man named George Lawson in 1981. He had passed in 2004. She had no children, no siblings she could identify, no family. "I don't know who I was before," she told the deputy. "I've tried to remember. For years I tried. It's like reaching into a dark room and touching the edges of things but never finding the light switch." She agreed to a DNA sample, a cheek swab, simple, painless. The sample was sent to the state lab. The comparison would take 3 weeks. While they waited, Emma began sorting through George's belongings. She had been meaning to do it for years. His workshop, his closet, the boxes in the garage. She was looking for nothing in particular. Old tax documents, a watch he had worn every day. And then in the bottom of a toolbox wrapped in a cloth that had yellowed with age, she found a small metal locket, tarnished, dented, the clasp stiff with disuse. She pried it open. Inside, a photograph, faded, water-stained, the edges soft and brown, a wedding portrait, a bride in a white dress, smiling, her hair pinned up, her eyes bright. The groom beside her, his face damaged by water, the features blurred beyond recognition. But the bride was clear. The bride was unmistakable. Emma stared at the photograph. Her hands trembled. She did not recognize the woman, and yet she did. The smile, the way the hair was pinned, the shape of the jaw. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected a person she had never met but somehow knew. She called the deputy. The deputy called Tors. Tors called David. George Lawson, it emerged, had found the locket in the pocket of the coat Emma was wearing the night Walter Briggs brought her in from the storm. He had been a volunteer at Grace Fellowship in the late 70s, helping with maintenance, driving the van. He had found the locket while sorting donated clothing. He had opened it, seen the wedding photograph, and assumed it belonged to someone else. He had kept it, meaning to return it, and then forgotten. When Emma left the home, he followed. They married. He stored the locket in his toolbox and never mentioned it. He believed it was not hers. He believed it belonged to the life she could not remember, and he did not want to cause her pain. He was wrong. It was hers. It had always been hers. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday in October. The lab confirmed a match. Emma Lawson and Emily Harper were the same person. 35 years, 2,000 miles, a flood, a head injury, a lost word, a burned file, a locked door, and a locket in a toolbox. The disappearance was solved. David received the call at 4 in the afternoon. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the same chair. He set the phone down. He pressed his hands flat against the wood. He breathed. Tors drove to his house. She sat across from him. She told him the results. He nodded. He did not cry. He had cried enough for several lifetimes. What he felt was not relief exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you have carried so long your arms have forgotten what it is like to be empty. The question that remained, the one Tors team spent the following months answering, was not who or where. It was why. Why had no one reconnected her? Why had the system swallowed her whole and offered nothing back? The answer, when it came, was not a conspiracy. It was not a villain. It was a chain of ordinary failures, each one small, each one understandable, each one devastating in combination. The flood knocked out phone lines. The clinic was overwhelmed. The records were handwritten, then lost in a fire. The recovery home operated outside the formal missing person network. The county borders between Ohio and Kentucky meant no single agency held the complete picture. The national database that might have matched Emma's description to Emily's report did not exist until the 90s, and by then, the trail was cold. Walter Briggs assumed someone else had called. Dorothy Fenn assumed the report had been filed. Helen Marsh assumed someone was looking. George Lawson assumed the locket belonged to a stranger. No one acted with cruelty. No one acted with intent. They acted with the limited tools, limited information, and limited time available to them, and the spaces between their actions were wide enough for a woman to fall through and never be found. Emma, when shown the wedding photographs, the honeymoon snapshots, the image of David in his blue jacket laughing during their first dance, went quiet for a long time. Then she touched the photograph of the blue jacket and said, softly, "Blue." Not as a question, as a recognition, a door opening 1 inch. The memories came in fragments over the following months, never completely, never in order: the smell of engine oil, a gravel drive, church bells, a casserole dish wrapped in foil, a man's voice saying, obviously, "Go, your mom's waiting." She could not rebuild the whole life, but she could touch the edges of it, the way she had described to the deputy, reaching into a dark room and finding, at last, a few familiar shapes. They met on a Saturday in November. Torres arranged it. A quiet room at the county office. No cameras, no reporters, just David and Emma and a box of tissues on the table between them. He walked in first, she walked in second. They stood 6 feet apart and looked at each other. 35 years, the face had changed. The hair was gray. The hands were older, but the eyes were the same. The set of the jaw was the same. The small crescent scar behind the left ear was the same. Neither moved for a long moment. Then David said, "Hey." She almost laughed, almost, "Hey, Blue." They sat down, they talked for 3 hours, not about the case, not about the investigation, about small things, the color of the bedroom they had painted, the casserole recipe, the watch she had meant to buy him, the nickname, the first dance, his foot on her shoe, her whisper, "You owe me new shoes, Harper." She remembered some of it, not all. The gaps remained and they would remain. She had built a life as Emma, a marriage, a home, a garden, a cat. Those years were real. They could not be returned or replaced. And David's years, the waiting, the flowers, the empty chair, the silence, those were real too. Neither life could be undone. Neither could be fully shared. But they could be acknowledged. They could be set beside each other on a table, like 2 photographs from the same roll of film, and someone could say, yes, this happened, and both of them mattered, and neither of them was a choice. The case was officially closed in January of 2011. Torres held a brief press conference. David did not attend. Emma did not attend. The story ran in the local paper and a few regional outlets. It did not become a national sensation. It was not a murder. There was no trial, no villain in handcuffs. Just a storm, a head injury, a lost word, and 35 years of ordinary human limitation. David still drives past Harlan Creek. He still places flowers on the bank every October 14th. But now, sometimes, Emma sits in the passenger seat. She looks at the water. She does not remember the crash. She does not remember the rain, but she remembers the blue, and that is enough. They talk on the phone most evenings. She has not moved back to Ohio. He has not moved to Oregon. The distance between them is real, and the years between them are real, and neither pretends otherwise. But on Sunday afternoons, she sends him photographs of her garden. And on Tuesday evenings, he tells her about the birdhouse he is rebuilding, the one with the crooked roof, the one she would have laughed at. The locket sits on her nightstand. The groom's face is still blurred, still lost to the water, but the bride is clear. The bride is smiling. And sometimes in the quiet of the evening, Emma picks it up, opens it, and looks at the woman in the white dress and thinks, yes, that was me. That was the beginning. And the ending was not an ending at all. It was just a very long, very quiet pause in a story that 2 people were still writing, even when neither of them knew the other was holding the pen. The mystery of Emily Harper was never about evil. It was never about malice or conspiracy or a single terrible act. It was about the fragile, ordinary, deeply human ways we fail each other without meaning to. A phone line down, a file mislaid, a word mistaken, a door left unlocked, a locket placed in a toolbox and forgotten. Small things, human things, the kind of things that happen every day in every town to people who will never make the news. And the answer, when it finally came, did not arrive through a dramatic confession or a brilliant deduction. It arrived through a photograph of a blue car, posted by a stranger on the internet, and a woman who typed a single sentence without knowing that 2,000 miles away, a man she had married 35 years ago was scrolling past, and would stop, and would freeze, and would pick up the phone, and would say, in a voice steady with 3.5 decades of waiting, "I think I found her." He did. And she, in her garden in Oregon, with the cat on her lap and the locket on the nightstand and the crescent scar behind her ear, looked at the photograph of the blue sedan on her screen and whispered a word she had been whispering for 35 years without knowing why. Blue. And this time someone heard.